and welcome to The Interview. My guest today is a man who can be described as a Washington insider. He's been part of the US government and foreign policy since the Reagan administration. He went to school with Bill and Hillary Clinton. He served as a national security advisor to US President Donald Trump and is now the author of a tell-all book on the Trump White House. Mr. John Bolton, welcome to WION, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My first question to you, Mr. Bolton, is why work for a man and give your loyalty to a man who, according to you, and I'm quoting from your book, offered personal favors to dictators, praised Xi Jinping for China's detention camps for the Uyghurs, somebody who thought Finland was a part of Russia, someone who thought it would be cool to invade Venezuela. These are all your stories. Why did you serve as a national security advisor for someone who said and thought all these things?
Right. Well, those are things that emerged during the course of the 17 months I worked there. I certainly didn't go into the job naively, but I had heard many criticisms about President Trump, but I had also had a number of conversations with where I thought there was a possibility to work together. He had watched me on Fox News for 10 years. I assumed he was listening to what I was saying at the time. And I thought the United States faced a number of threats and challenges internationally where I could make a contribution. I think I'm not alone in saying that it's an honor to work for the government at a high level, and a number of us took that opportunity and lasted as long as we could, basically.
So are you saying, sir, that the U.S. president's lack of integrity and honesty did not matter so much while you were a part of his team, but now that you're out, it matters enough for you to put it in a book in an election year?
Well, I think when you work for a president, there's a loyalty to the institution that means that you can't also be publicly critical of him. And it's just a matter of common sense that if his team is internally divided and going public on it, that's not something that works for anybody. So I think the trade-off that everybody has to make, and everybody makes a different judgment, is to continue to work for the national interest. And let me just stop there and make that point. We're not loyal to a man. I think we're loyal to the Constitution and the people of the United States. So you work for the national interest as long as you can, and then when you can't bear the calculus anymore of serving for somebody like Donald Trump, then the proper thing to do is to resign, which I did.
He says you were fired. Is this book your retaliation then?
No, I wrote a book after my service in the George W. Bush administration in 2007 called Surrender's Not an Option. So that was another indication. That book had been out for 10 years when the president offered me the job, and I don't think it's any great surprise that I've written another book. I say in the book that I reviewed Robert Gates' memoir of being Secretary of Defense, published during the Obama administration. And he was criticized for writing a book about an incumbent president. I wrote at the time, 2014, I wrote this book review, that I thought Gates had almost an obligation to talk about what he had done in the Obama administration so that the people can see behind the curtain and understand what it's like for decisions to be made. I feel I've done the same thing. I've put it to the people. They'll make up their own minds.
You're described as a Washington insider. You've worked closely with various presidents. How would you describe Donald Trump's relationship with India and India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi?
Well, I think he has a good personal relationship with Prime Minister Modi. I think part of Donald Trump's trouble in international affairs is that he cannot distinguish between personal relationships with other national leaders and the actual bilateral relations between the two countries. I think he saw that Prime Minister Modi was very popular among Indian Americans, people who have come from the subcontinent or are born of Indian heritage. They had a big rally for the Prime Minister when he came to the U.S., the Howdy Modi rally in Houston. And he invited the president. Prime Minister's a good politician, too. And Trump saw that as a great way to be in front of tens of thousands of Indian Americans. And that shows what Trump's real focus is, which is his reelection this November. In terms of the actual bilateral relations between the two countries, it's much more complicated. But the president really doesn't get into things that I think others would consider strategic imperatives, like, for example, how to deal with China.
Since you've mentioned China, India and China have had a border standoff recently. The U.S. at the same time is redeploying forces from Europe to the Indo-Pacific, to South China Sea and elsewhere. If the situation between Beijing and Delhi were to escalate, would Trump clearly pick sides? And how far would he be prepared to go to back India, assuming that he chooses to back India?
Well, I don't know which way he would go, honestly, and I don't think he does either. I think he sees the geostrategic relationship with China, for example, almost exclusively through the prism of trade. Trade is important because China has stolen intellectual property from the United States and other countries engaged in forced technology transfers for decades. And it forms a major part of their economic success and therefore their military power. But that's really as far as it goes. I don't know what Trump will do after the November election once that guardrail is removed. I think he'll be back. He won't be criticizing Beijing for putting the Uyghurs in concentration camps or repressing Hong Kong. He'll be back to the big China trade deal. So if things were to develop between India and China in a more critical fashion, I'm not sure where he would come down.
And do you think that things are developing for the worse between India and China? There's a lot of back and forth. There are talks that are still on, but the November election is still a few months away. Do you think this could escalate to a limited conflict?
Well, I hope it does not at the present time, because with 4 months to go to an American election, you are simply not going to get Donald Trump's attention one way or the other. The fact is, China has been behaving in a belligerent fashion all around its periphery, certainly in the East China Sea, the South China Sea. Its relations with Japan have declined, with India, you're well aware of the facts there, and with others. So I think this is part of China's effort to assert itself through not just political military means, through the Belt and Road Initiative and others, to gain increased sway over countries that become dependent on it economically. Sri Lanka has been subject to this debt diplomacy, Pakistan for many years, many countries in Central Asia. So this is, I think, part of, to give credit where it's due, I think China does have a grand strategy here. I think it's pursuing it. I think the United States has been asleep at the switch, and I think many other countries have been asleep as well. It's time to wake up and talk more amongst ourselves. For example, Prime Minister Modi has been a big advocate of greater trilateral cooperation between India, Japan, and the United States. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think we ought to do more of it.
Let me make sure I've understood this right. You're saying that if things were to escalate between India and China at this moment, there is no guarantee that Donald Trump will back India against China.
That's correct. I'm not sure how much he understands the significance of the border clash in Ladakh. I don't think he knows anything about the history of these clashes over the decades between India and China. He may have been briefed on it, but history doesn't really stick with him. I think his gut instinct for the next 4 months is take anything off the table that complicates what is already a difficult re-election campaign for him. So what he would want would be quiet along the border, whether it benefits China or India. From his point of view, no news is good news.
Right. And as the National Security Advisor, previous National Security Advisor of the U.S. and otherwise also, in your dealings with China, I'm sure you've had the chance to understand how Xi Jinping operates. Why do you think he's doing what he is? Why is he on a war path with the world, picking fights with practically everyone in the middle of a pandemic?
Well, I think it goes back before the pandemic. I think he sees American weakness when he sees Donald Trump, and I think he's right. I think he has Trump's measure. When Donald Trump sits across the table from Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, it's not a contest of equals. It always made me worry what he might give away. So particularly in the context of an election campaign, he may believe that he has even greater latitude to take action, to threaten. Could be India today, it could be in the South China Sea tomorrow, we don't know. But I do think this is not a short-term problem, and I think the pandemic probably has persuaded Xi Jinping to be even more assertive, to cover up, as they have been covering up these past 6 months, how bad the medical effect of the disease was in China, how bad the effect was on China's economy, and what they did to cover up the source and the consequences of the disease. This is really indicative of the kind of government we're dealing with in Beijing, and they didn't cooperate internationally. They tried to use the World Health Organization for their own purposes, and I'm afraid largely succeeded.
Donald Trump came to office with a promise to make America great again. Do you think under his watch, America is losing the so-called superpower status, and that this pandemic, more than anything else, has exposed the lack of leadership?
Well, I think he has done certain things that were important. The U.S. defense budget is increased very significantly over the low levels of the Obama administration. But again, if Trump is reelected, I'm not sure that he would continue the spending at that point. I think the lack of adequate response to the pandemic is very troubling, and I think it was due in the early months of January and February to Trump's unwillingness to hear bad news about China, bad news about his buddy Xi Jinping, that we lost months where we could have taken steps to mitigate the disease. But I think the damage Trump has done is repairable, at least after one term, and I think the United States remains the critical country for dealing with the challenges we're going to face in this century from countries like China.
A word on his response to the coronavirus pandemic. In the last 24 hours, the U.S. has recorded more than 63,000 new cases. Has the president failed on this count?
Well, I think he's failed in many respects. I think there was an empty chair in the Oval Office in the early months. I don't think he took the necessary actions. And it's a good example of a crisis for the U.S. and other countries where a strategic response, a plan that one sticks to and adapts to the circumstances is necessary, and not the typical Trump ad hoc, anecdotal, on again one day, off again the next day approach, which is what he's followed and which I think is why we're still in trouble with it.
How would you describe Donald Trump's equation with the Chinese president? He's the one who's been waging a trade war against China, but I think you have suggested that he was seeking China's help for re-election.
Right. Well, I think he used the tariffs because he thought they were domestically popular, and I think they have been. He used them because for too long, for decades, America allowed China to take advantage of it, and that needed to be changed in a very fundamental way. But I think his ultimate objective is the big trade deal. And so after the election, I think the policies that look tough toward China now could easily be reversed.
Another development in the recent past has been the sanctions vis-a-vis the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. The Uyghur persecution has been in public knowledge for a while now, but the world chose to pretend that it wasn't happening until they decided they wanted to send a message to China. Is that how you see it, that this was a convenient time and so the Uyghur issue is being brought up both by America and the rest of the world?
Yes. Look, I describe in my book how the National Security Council was considering sanctions against China in late 2018. And the president told Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, and me at that time, told me at the White House Christmas dinner, stop this. And in effect, it did stop until after I left, and then once the virus began to spread around the world, so that the administration was now prepared to impose sanctions. But this is something that could change in a heartbeat after the election.
You've said that Donald Trump has a poor understanding of foreign policy. He famously or infamously said that all India has done in Afghanistan is build a library. Did you or your team not try to introduce him to the facts?
Well, of course we did, many times. And I'm not just saying me, plenty of people before me, and I'm sure plenty of people after me. He doesn't hear what he doesn't want to hear. And he makes up a reality that he feels comfortable in. I don't doubt that there was waste and fraud in America's aid program in Afghanistan over the years. That's something that we should have taken stronger steps against. But it doesn't thereby undercut the anti-terrorist policy that it's still important to maintain. I think others could have done more in Afghanistan, and he's right on that too, but that doesn't mean our response is to get out, which is what, of course, he would like to pursue.
You've also written about India's Balakot strikes on Pakistan. How did the Trump White House assess what was happening, and what was the message that you sent out to both India and Pakistan?
Well, this took place when we were in Hanoi for the second summit with Kim Jong-un, and both Mike Pompeo and I were there, and of course away from our base of operations in Washington. We spent hours on the phone with Ajit Doval and others in India and with counterparts in Pakistan. And my assessment was, and I said publicly at the time, and I said to Ajit a couple days after as well, we thought India had acted in self-defense. We thought the actions were appropriate. And we think that there were responsible steps taken to de-escalate what could have been a very serious crisis.
The U.S. president has also, sir, repeatedly offered to mediate in Kashmir, and he's been told every time that this is a bilateral issue. Why does he keep repeating these offers?
You know, I can remember several times where I've explained India's long-standing position on Kashmir. And it just doesn't sink in. I mean, there's no grander explanation for it. You tell him that India thinks it's a bilateral issue and that it has to be resolved by negotiation with Pakistan. Donald Trump thinks everything is a deal. Everything is a deal. And who better to mediate it than him? So, you know, you're going to hear it again. If he wins, you'll hear it for the next 4 years.
I'm very curious. I want to know how this conversation goes. You say this is a bilateral issue and India does not want mediation. How does he respond?
Well, I'm just saying I'm going to offer it to him. They don't have to take it up, but I think I could solve it. I think I could solve it in a day. I'll just sit down with him. We'll solve it.
I think you've had a fun job for 17 months. What happened in the Iran oil case? I understand India made it amply clear that not buying oil from Iran is going to hurt Indian interests. And Donald Trump, according to your book, had a conversation with Mike Pompeo. Can you tell our viewers more about that?
Well, the issue had to do with waivers from the reimposition of the sanctions in late 2018. And some 9 countries, including India and Japan, were granted waivers. I have to say at the time I thought that was a mistake. I thought we should have brought the sanctions down hard and firmly across the board. The president decided otherwise. So the question came up when the waivers duration came to its expiration point, would we extend them or not? And I felt that although we had obviously allies and friends involved in the waivers, that the priority had to be on pressure on Iran. And basically what the president wanted to do was find a way to end the waivers without getting the blame for it himself. And this is also fairly typical of the way he operates. He's prepared to make decisions, but he doesn't want to own the decisions. So we found a way to do it that would make it look like it had happened without him being involved in it. The same ploy applied to Japan. I just have to say, and I know this increased difficulty for India, but the focus has to be on the threat posed by Iran and its nuclear weapons program. We offered to find other ways to get oil to India from other producers in the Gulf. It turned out India was benefiting because the Iranians were selling oil so far below the world market price because they had to find somebody to sell it to. But, you know, everybody else is buying at the world market price. And given the greater objective of stopping Iran from getting nuclear weapons, that was how we felt it should come out.
Greater objective is one way to put it. The Black Lives Matter protests have been on, and racism has become a political issue, more in America than anywhere else. But you've been quoted as saying that Trump is not a racist, though most of his statements suggest otherwise. What makes you say this?
Well, I listened to him for 17 months, and I didn't hear him say things that I would consider racist. He's done other things that people have characterized as racist. I find any evidence of racism to be unacceptable. If I thought that were dominating his views in national security, it would have affected my own decision on how long to stay. I think this is a very serious subject in the United States, but I don't think racism is something unique to the United States. I think you find it everywhere around the world, and it's a serious problem for us. We're the only country that's fought a civil war to end slavery, and all the effects have not yet been eliminated. But the objective to me should be the same objective that Martin Luther King articulated in the March on Washington in 1963, when he said he longed for the day when America, this is the I Had a Dream speech, that people will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And that struck me as right in 1963. It strikes me as right today.
Would you concede that America under Donald Trump is more divided than ever before?
Well, I think it's become more divided, and I think in part that's due to Trump, but I think it's due to other factors as well. I think there's a rising left wing in the Democratic Party that's very troubling, and its view of America and its heritage. So there's a lot of blame to go around here, but certainly part of it is due to Trump's behavior.
My next question is something that I'm sure you face a lot of times, but in your memoir, you've mentioned that Democrats should have gone further with their impeachment efforts. You've mentioned that Donald Trump has committed higher crimes and misdemeanors than the Ukraine scandal. But you've remained silent throughout the impeachment hearings, despite repeated summons from the House of Representatives. Why is that?
Well, let me correct a few things in your question first. The House of Representatives never subpoenaed me. For all the talk about how much they wanted me to testify, what they did with every other witness, they never did for me. When it came to the Senate, I said I was prepared to testify, and the Senate voted against having witnesses, which makes it pretty hard to do. I explain in the book at greater length, I think the House advocates of impeachment committed impeachment malpractice. We've seen how a successful effort to remove a president can take place. It was during the Watergate scandal in the 1970s, where Democrats and Republicans worked together on a bipartisan basis. The House Democrats took exactly the opposite approach. They pushed Republicans into a partisan corner, and they got a partisan outcome. So I thought whatever I was going to say would have been lost in the shuffle. The House Democrats didn't want to cooperate, and now they're going to reap the consequences, because while they impeached Trump in the House, they failed to convict him in the Senate. So their whole argument that the impeachment would deter Trump from this sort of conduct has proven completely wrong. By being acquitted, they've empowered exactly the kind of conduct they object to. So by their own measure, they achieved exactly the opposite of what they said they wanted.
In your book, you've also mentioned several episodes about Trump's willingness to give personal favors to dictators like Turkish leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan, even to Xi Jinping, and these are some of the obvious names that you have revealed. Who else did Donald Trump offer personal favors to?
Well, I don't know, because I wasn't in the room every single minute of every single day. To me, it was part of a pattern of behavior that was very troubling. And whether these other incidents would have amounted to what our Constitution requires, high crimes and misdemeanors for impeachment and conviction, I don't know. But the House advocates of impeachment weren't willing to find out.
You've also written in detail about U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, saying that he was a Trump loyalist, but he's considered quitting because he's been so frustrated. The fact is Pompeo still remains in office in his post. Is the frustration, though, still there, since you've worked so closely with him? And also, how does the rest of the team, how does the staff of Donald Trump see him and rate him? I'm sure they have conversations amongst each other.
Well, you could certainly ask them at the appropriate time. I mean, I think Mike has higher political aspirations, and I think, like others, he sees being tied to Trump as a plus from that point of view. I think it will turn out to be a negative, so my ultimate conclusion is I feel sorry for him.
Do you think there are factions within the Republican Party against seeing Donald Trump at the White House anymore? And if there are, what explains their support for Trump during the impeachment trial, and they're silent now when the U.S. is doing so miserably in the pandemic?
Yeah. Well, I think the explanation for impeachment is they saw a partisan attack by the Democrats and they responded in a partisan fashion. I'm not saying that's a good idea. I'm saying that's the political reality of what happened. There was a recent poll that said something like 23% of Republicans would prefer a nominee other than Donald Trump this November. That's not going to happen. He is going to be the nominee. And I think at this point the election is a toss-up. I don't think we know who will win. But I think after the election, whether Trump wins or loses, there will be within the Republican Party a very considerable conversation as to the future direction of the party. I hope I can participate in that. I think it's going to be important to cut this albatross off from around our neck and try and get back in the mode of a more civil discourse politically in the U.S.
You've been called a lot of things by the US president. Some interesting adjectives. I have a list here. A liar, a washed up guy who broke the law, incompetent, a big old fool. How do you respond to remarks like these?
Well, look, I think they're juvenile. I think they demean the office of the presidency, and I don't think they merit a response, frankly.
Okay. Donald Trump also wants to serve more than 2 terms as president. How do you rate his chances of serving more than 1 term?
Well, I think the election is very close. I don't think we know what the result will be. I think he should be a 1-term president. So for the first time in my adult life, I'm not going to vote for the Republican nominee because I just can't in good conscience after having served for 17 months.
But you also said you'll not vote for Joe Biden. So then is it Kanye West?
No, I will write in the name of a conservative Republican, and I'll make that decision between now and November.
From the invasion of Iraq to the Iran-Contra affair, you've been part of some of the most controversial episodes in American foreign policy. How do you see your career?
Well, I got involved in politics first in 1964 as a boy, handing out leaflets and ringing doorbells for Barry Goldwater. I've been a conservative Republican. I've been deeply steeped in conservative philosophy. And what I've tried to do in my jobs in government service is advance American national interest through that philosophy. And if history got that part right, then I don't really care how the rest of it falls out.
Mr. John Bolton, I'm so glad you could make time. Thank you very much. We wish you all the success for your book and for all your endeavors. Thank you.
Well, thanks again for having me.